Okay, so just what is grief then? So grief is our natural response to loss, and grief is the natural response that we experience when either someone or something that we love or value is taken away from us. So it might be the loss of a loved one, it might be the breakdown of a relationship, it could be becoming pregnant and grieving for the way life was before you were pregnant. It may be losing a pet, changing jobs, or any way of life that has changed in some way, becoming a carer, or even being diagnosed with a health condition. Other experiences of loss may be due to things like children leaving home, infertility, grieving for the life or the child that you always saw yourself as having, or separation from friends and family for whatever reason that might be. The more significant the loss, the more intense the grief that you experience is likely to be. And many of us have gone through a grieving process as I'm recording this course, we're in the third lockdown. And many of us have, or probably most of us have gone through a grieving experience right throughout lockdown for many different reasons, and have probably gone in and out of grief a number of times over the last few months, which is why the lockdown has been as difficult as it has been. There's no right or wrong way to grieve, but there are healthy ways to deal with the grieving process. And often the pain of loss can feel very intense and very overwhelming. And you might experience all kinds of difficult and unexpected emotions, ranging from shock or anger to disbelief and guilt and profound sadness as well. The pain of grief can also disrupt your physical health, making it difficult to sleep, to eat, or even difficult to think straight for some people. Now, these are all normal reactions to loss, and the more significant the loss, or the more intense or the closer the relationship, then the more intense your grief is likely to be. Coping with the loss of someone you love or something you love is probably one of life's biggest challenges, and we all probably associate grieving most with the death of a loved one, which is often the cause of the most intense type of grief. But any loss, as I said, can cause grief. So even the subtle losses in our lives can trigger a sense of grief. So just building on what I said on the last slide, you might grieve if you've moved away from home. I can remember grieving when I left home when I got married. And sometimes the changes that we experience in our lives may be positive changes, but then that doesn't stop us grieving in some way for the way life was before. So it could be things like graduating from college, changing jobs, things like when your children start school, you may be, really looking forward to them starting school, but that doesn't mean to say you don't grieve for having their presence around during the day. It could be losing a job or even changing jobs, or if a colleague leaves and moves on to another job, that can cause the rest of the team or the rest of your colleagues to go through a grieving process. Often people who retire go through a grieving process, and that's often grieving for a loss of the day-to-day routines and the company that we had in place. Many people grieve if they suddenly find themselves becoming a carer, or if they themselves get diagnosed with a health condition. Many of us can go through a very intense period of grief losing a pet, and grieving when children leave home, whether that's because they're married and going off to set up homes of their own, or whether it's going off to university. Parents often go through a grieving process for that. So there are many different reasons why we can go through a grieving process. And any relationship that ends, whether it's through divorce or separation, or a friendship breaks down, or a friend moves away, or a family member, any situation where something has changed or there's been a transition in life and something has changed to the way it was before is what can trigger a grieving process. This is another way of looking at grieving, and this is called the whirlpool of grief. And the way that life goes, we coasting along the river of life, and then all of a sudden something happens, and we start to slip down the waterfall of bereavement. And on the way down, we experience shock, numbness, and denial, and then we go all the way down the waterfall, get it to the bottom, and feel a loss. We feel the loss and emotional disorganization, and it's a sense of feeling like we're falling apart. And it's a kind of emotion, and I think unless you've been through it, it's very difficult to actually describe how it feels, and it is a sense of falling apart. And you might experience severe disorganization and a feeling like you feel all washed up, or you might feel you're at breakdown point. And as you go all the way down, we end up at the bottom in what's called the whirlpool of grief. And often when we experience a loss of some kind, it's almost like we need to stay in the whirlpool of grief for a certain length of time before and process those emotions until we're able to begin thinking about, okay, then moving along and going across towards a meaningful life. And often, if you are deep in the whirlpool of grief and you're feeling angry or you're feeling this intense sadness, and if people are saying things to you like, oh, come on, you've been grieving long enough, or you've been crying long enough, or look on the bright side, and all of those sorts of things, if we're at a point where we need to be in the whirlpool of grief, you'll find those things really, really difficult to hear, because we only start moving along onto reorganization and loving again when we're actually ready and when we've processed those emotions. And as we heard earlier on, there is no set length of time that is right for anybody to be in that whirlpool of grief. So it's whatever is right for you. Alongside, now we can get stuck there, so it is important for us to be putting things in place like keeping ourselves physically well. Starting to see friends will help us to move towards reorganization alongside processing those emotions. And when we go down the whirlpool of grief, sometimes we will find ourselves on the rocks, and on the rocks is when we feel pain and physical symptoms, and we'll talk about those physical symptoms a little bit later on. So as you come out of the whirlpool of grief, you'll feel a sense of mourning and starting to accept the absence of whatever it is in your life. And then where we said you have a severe disorganization, it's almost like you reorganize your life again, reorganize your situation, reorganize your emotions, your feelings. And where it says loving again, it doesn't necessarily mean loving someone else. It might just be living again. But then bereavement is what happens to you. We become bereaved, or we feel bereft for some reason because life has changed. Grief is what we feel, and mourning is what we do. That's the behaviour that we do, is the mourning. Okay, so there are a few different trains of thought about how we grieve, and going back a number of years ago, in fact it's in 1969, the psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross introduced what became known as the 5 stages of grief. Now the thoughts are that we don't actually go through these as stages, is what more modern train of thought is. But this is a helpful way of helping us to understand some of the emotions that we might be feeling. And these stages were based on her studies of the feelings that patients facing terminal illness went through, but I think they can be very well related to lots of other negative life changes and losses, so whether it's the death of a loved one or a breakup. So the 5 stages of grief are, the first one is shock or denial, and the kind of thoughts where you just can't believe that this is happening to you. So it might be it's a feeling of fear, a feeling of numbness. You might start sort of blaming other people, feeling confused, and just disbelief that the situation has actually happened. Anger is the next one, and you might start questioning, why is this happening? Who is to blame? May start blaming services, may start being angry at yourself or at the person that it's affected, maybe angry at other people. Sense of frustration, anxiety, feeling irritated with things, and there also may be feelings of embarrassment and shame in that stage. And then depression and detachment. So depression and detachment is a feeling of being overwhelmed with grief and lack of energy, feeling of helplessness, and often people in the depression stage feel a real intensity of sadness, and that stage is sometimes where we can get stuck in grieving, and it's that feeling of emptiness and despair and loneliness. And in this stage, this is maybe where you cry a lot or feel quite emotionally unstable. And one that actually is non-heard is guilt, and often people feel guilty for many different things, and I know I did when my mother died. And you might regret or feel guilty about things that you did or didn't say or do, and that can stay with people for a long time, and that can often be the reason why people find it hard to move forward with their lives. or it could be feeling guilty for feeling happiness again or feeling joy again. And some people may go towards acceptance, start returning to a meaningful life, and then start feeling guilty and withdraw and pull back again. Or it might be that you feel guilty that there was something that you didn't do to prevent the death, even if there wasn't anything that you could have done actually. Dialogue and bargaining. Bargaining is when you are struggling to find meaning for what has happened. And it might be you saying, oh, if only this could happen, or I'd do anything if only this could change, or if only that person would come back. In this stage, you may feel a real desire to tell your story and to talk about what's happened. In this stage, you may be reaching out to other people and beginning to want to sort of talk it through. And then in moving on to acceptance, and when we get to the acceptance stage, it doesn't mean to say that you, as I mentioned before, love that person any less or the situation isn't any less painful. It just means that you've kind of processed those emotions and the feelings, and it's getting to a point now where you're thinking about how you're going to go on with your life. Doesn't mean to say that you've forgotten the person. It might feel that you're starting finding meaning in it all, you're exploring new options and just beginning to move forward a little bit.